Before we hear from Nikki, may we begin our time together by taking a moment of silence to honor all those whose lives have been impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. May we bring them into this space with us and honor them. And may we all find the courage now to speak out. Nikki.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share my story here today. So my story began in my church. I received the attention of a man who served as a deacon in the church and was considered a pillar of our community. I was abused by this man from the time I was 5 until I was about 9 years old. My abuse happened in the one place I should have been safe. It happened within the walls of my church. It took me quite a while to realize that there was something extremely inappropriate about the attention I was receiving. I'd been taught that adults were to be trusted, and in order to be respectful, I was to do as they told me to. It wasn't until about 6 years after my abuse ended until I would finally share with my family what had taken place. My family didn't know what to do when I finally shared with them, and they handled the situation the best that they knew how. Many years later, I would learn there had been rumors in town of this man's interest in little girls, but for reasons I will never fully understand, no one came forward. To my knowledge, my abuser was never confronted, nor was he ever challenged. I do not know if there was others, but I'm fairly certain that I was not the only one. Even though I faced my abuser on a weekly basis during church services, I decided I couldn't share what had taken place to my congregation. Too many people would be devastated by the news. Not only did I worry about how it might actually impact the man who had stolen my innocence, I was worried about his wife, I was worried about my family, and I was worried about my congregation. The weight of responsibilities would rest on my young shoulders, and the effects of abuse would ripple through all I would touch. I would eventually walk away from the concept of regular church attendance and the concept of church. This was not because I was overwhelmed by the abuse that had taken place within the church, but because I had become so disconnected from anyone who might want to care for me. In my early teens and early 20s, I began to share my story with people who I had allowed to become close to me. But I often used it as a reason to permit people to walk away from what I viewed as damaged goods. I received ashes and turned them into something more beautiful than I had ever imagined. My church began to become my place of redemption. One of those ways that it became my place of redemption is that 3 close friends and I traveled back to a college dorm room one weekend in May of 2011. We traveled there so that the friend could actually take control of the room in which she had been raped in. It was one of the most hardest and most beautiful weekends of my life. We prayed for her, we cried for her, and we claimed victory in how Christ had restored her to complete and total beauty. I have often heard survivors share their stories. Those that pierce my heart are often those who have attempted to deal with the drama on their own. It's how we listen and how we support that can either deepen the wound or provide the ointment that will move us closer to healing. Several years ago, our congregation brought in a new pastor. We had searched for quite a while, and the congregation was excited that we had finally found someone we felt would be an incredible fit. Just a few weeks into his new role, several of the mothers in the congregation began to feel uncomfortable with some of the interactions he was having with our preteen boys. As time went on, there were too many occurrences to ignore, and several families began to share their discomfort with the church leadership. The new pastor was spoken to and asked to be aware of the concerns that the families were voicing. He explained his actions had simply been misunderstood and spoke with several of the parents who had concerns. We decided the behaviors had been addressed, and in love, we chose to move on. Within weeks, the behavior had not only returned, they had intensified. The parents again expressed their concerns, and as they began to share their son's individual circumstances, it became alarmingly evident that multiple boys were being groomed, and in textbook fashion. The pastor was immediately suspended. Eventually, the church board felt there was compelling enough reasons to dismiss him. But in an effort to remain respectful to the pastor and his family, no details were ever released to the congregation. This forced members of the congregations to piece together what they believed to be true, and only on parts of the events that had actually taken place. Many became outraged by what they felt was an unfair dismissal. For the first time in my life, including my history of abuse, I experienced the harsh reality of how hurtful church families can be to one another. We had little desire to hear one another's perspectives, and we did not hesitate to pierce those with a differing point of view. Our church brought in a third party to attempt to talk through the travesty and move toward a journey of healing, but we were simply unable to do so. Who ultimately suffered here? Our children. The boys who had been targeted became confused by what was tearing our congregation apart and began to question the part that they played in the tension. Our tight-knit church became a place where anger loomed, and our young people received an up-close and personal picture of how ugly Christians can be to one another. Ultimately, several families decided to leave the congregation because they could not agree on the decision to fire the pastor. Many others decided that they would leave if he had actually remained. Despite how you feel about this situation, let me be clear, there were no winners here. We all lost. While most of us understand the reality of staggering statistics, we still struggle to find a tangible way to shed light into this darkness. Sexual abuse and violence make people feel uncomfortable, and we find it easier to not talk about it at all. How often has the church tried to cover up this dark subject matter by telling ourselves it's not as bad as it seems, or if we deal with it too publicly, we just might ruin our organizations. I wonder when we'll finally be ready to call it what it is. I wonder when we'll get as serious about preventing the abuse as we do about creating programs to deal with its aftermath. When will we be able to listen to survivors' horrific stories and actually stimulate their healing instead of traumatizing them again? For me, the more I share my story, the more I am released from its control. But as we all know, survivors are diverse, and we need to have equally diverse venues in which we can all heal. We must be open to asking ourselves, how can we help you? We need to better understand the need of survivors and equip ourselves with new ways to meet them where they are. Equally important is how we work to educate one another. I truly believe the first step is to become comfortable in speaking out. This week, because of this venue, I was able to share my story with another friend who I had never shared with before. As I did, he shared with me a story of his attempted rape. When most of them sitting in our congregation have been touched in some way, shape, or form by this dark subject matter. I encourage you all to be confident in how you choose to speak out and no longer let this live in the shadows. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I've been introduced, but I would just like to do the introduction again. My name is Constance. My name and girls and boys was not available. We have 67% of women beaten by their husbands, and 57% of women experience forced sex. 50% of reported rape victims under 15 years old, and 13% under 7 years. Being a victim myself for over 10 years, I finally freed myself in 1998 by just walking out on my children's father. And in doing so, I began to help young women in my diocese with similar problems by doing counseling and awareness in the communities, that's in the rural communities, and in ministry groups. During this time in 2013, I witnessed and assisted 2 cases. A PLW, a person living with HIV/AIDS, was bashed and beaten to death by a police husband. The second I've witnessed was 2 12-year twin girls sexually assaulted by their stepfather. And a mother of 3 in 2014 was beaten and bashed up with a full bottle of wine in 2014. And that's what's showing on the screen. We do advocacy through ministry groups, through primary and secondary schools, community leaders. In the community levels, we have chiefs, church leaders that are clergy and laity, and in rural local level government staff we work with. And doing so for advocacy, we do training. As peer educators, we train these people as peer educators to carry out awareness in their own little communities. We also train them as home-based care. In home-based care, in order to take care of the survivors that they find in their homes, and life skills to women and girls out of school so that they will improve lifestyle and sustain themselves in their own families. We also have care and support, treatment and services. Treatment and services are carried out in health centers, in our health centers, both in the government and in the church health facilities. And also we have a program and a place run by our provincial Council of Women. And we have also services, paralegal services, carried out in our communities also. In our intervention programs, we have CAP, which is called Community Action and Participation. This initiative is from the Department of Health. Its focus is to help people in the communities to take a change in lifestyles in their local communities by taking ownership of their own health, economy, and education. Programs are effective and have impact on people's lives, economy, and education in the rural community, but we still continue to lack in many areas in Papua New Guinea. Our government fundings are very limited. They don't trickle down to the rural area where we work in. The people who are trained to carry out activities and awareness and all this in the rural areas are not sent down there. They don't continue. And we have also government in the rural areas who are not interested in a way to talk about sex and gender-based violence and issues surrounding all this. What is showing on the screen is one of the trainings we had on community action and participation. Was done last year in one of our communities in the diocese that I work in. We train people in the community to take care of their own health, economy, and education. Understanding and commitment of gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence, and the surrounding issues are not, it's lacking. And our government that they don't have the will to talk about this. That's one of the things that we lack. Thank you.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. I hope I'll manage this gadget. We have heard the stories from our two sisters to my right. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what went wrong? Because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God created a man and a woman undifferentiated. He created Adam, Adama, which means human and not male. God created them human, but socialization constructed them as men and women. But then God, because Jesus then came to begin a process of setting things right as it was originally planned. John 10 verse 10 talks about he came so that all may have life and have life in abundance. All, I've underlined all. In Swaziland, for instance, our constitution, I'll just go through the first bullet point, says that all people are equal before and under the law in all spheres of political, economic, social, and cultural life, and in every other respect, and shall enjoy equal protection of the law. But is that the reality? Age 21 is the age of majority. But unfortunately, women in my country, at age 21, depending on whether they choose to get married or not, they lose their legal capacity. As a married woman, you cannot conclude legal transactions, you cannot access a loan, you need assistance of your husband to do that. When my daughter had to go to secondary school, I had to get my husband to write a letter from Kenya to allow a bank in Swaziland, me, a working woman, and earning a lot more money than my husband, to be allowed to take a loan that I was going to pay myself. But everyone is equal before the law. Registration of the land, both title deed land or Swazi Nation land, you can't do that without a male, including your son who is 5 years old, because you can't do that on your own. And not so long ago, as I was working in the municipality, we developed a gender-based policy, which was approved by government, but it is not implemented. Despite the fact that government, under the Constitution, is supposed to ensure that laws that make these policies, implementable are put in place. Culture and tradition are used to justify discriminating against women. In Swaziland, when your husband dies, you are in mourning for 30 days and you don't get out of the house, and you don't see no male person. And at that time is when all your property and whatever your husband has left for you and your children is taken away from you. You cannot make decisions in respect of your sexual and reproductive rights. You can't tell a man, let's use a condom, despite the fact you know he is promiscuous. And maybe later on you can go through, this is statistics between January and now of gender-based violence against women. 387 rape cases in 9 months, including those of children. My sister said she was 5 years old. Education, girls are socialized, to take domestic science, what other things? Domestic science, home economics. Not, the technical subjects are a domain for boys. And then we have customs like Wenzisa, where women, the family can choose a husband for you, whether you want that husband or not. And when they pay dowry for you, that is your ticket to gender-based violence, because the man has acquired you. And then divorce in Swazi tradition does not favor women, because even if you walk away from the marriage, when the man dies, they bring you back to come and perform the traditional rites. Of the major preoccupations of the church in the 21st century. Jesus, the man we follow, believed in equality between women and men. And for him, it was not just a matter of human rights, but a matter of divine justice. In John 3:16, he came to die for all, not just for one group of people. So both justice and righteousness are divine attributes that describe the nature of God. In Jesus' framework of thinking, in a culture where women were seen only in relation to men, Christ was not only was Christ not only liberated them from their oppressive traditions, but he regarded them as equals. The Samaritan woman, for instance, she was the first person to whom he revealed his identity as Messiah. Mary Magdalene was the first person Jesus revealed himself after resurrection and equally sent to go and tell, the boastful Peters and the Johns and whatever who wants to sit on the left and the right. But Mary Magdalene was the first one. That is our Jesus. He never silenced them when they engaged him critically. The woman of the woman who wanted him to heal her daughter, when she was called a dog, she said, Jesus, dog or not dog, my daughter must be healed. And Jesus said, I give up, woman, your daughter will be healed. He offered public forgiveness to prostitutes. To forgive a prostitute was to give her an equal stand before God as everyone else. And what about us? Our red pens are ready. In relation to the church, we also have misinterpreted and used the Bible to justify the oppression of women. The favorable scripture is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. Women, submit to your husband. And we forget as to the Lord. So we just say submit to your husband. The church also teaches us that husbands are to love their wives in the same way Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. This giving up carries the implication of giving up one's right or privileges. But if Jesus is the example, it extends even to laying down one's life for the other. But you know what happens these days? If you go through these papers, the men are not laying down their lives for their women, but they are taking the lives of their women. I'm talking church. I'm not talking people of the world. I'm talking church. This is the perspective which is to characterize a Christian husband's attitude to his wife and also the church towards its church members. It is time the church became accountable. It is time the church became the strong tower, the center in the town of Thebes. Read Judges chapter 9 from verse 50 to 53, or you can start, somewhere there in the middle, I can't remember now. The tower was a safe space. It was a place where all men and women and the entire population would flee to and barricade themselves against the Amalek of these places. The church should be that strong tower. The church should be that place where people can go into and, barricade themselves from Amalek and use the milling stone of the word and prayer, to heal the wounds of the bleeding people. But is that the case? And in the church, as we have heard this morning, that the church has become the lion's den instead of the strong tower where we hide. Let us talk openly about sex issues or sexual issues. Let us empower the powerless economically. And clergy should lead by example. In this short time, I've seen a lot of things and I've heard a lot of things in the house of God. But it is time we lead by example, starting with our families and then extending to the family of God. If you beat your wife, what will prevent you or what will make you to be able to take care of the women in the church? Women have come to me and said, if church is like this, then I leave it. Let our prophetic voice be heard, speaking truth to powers that be. Why delay laws that speak to these situations? Our parliaments, they write constitutions, they put policies in place, But when those laws have to be promulgated, it is a hard time. In Swaziland, there is only one elected woman and the rest are men. So if it is law that is against them, then it's an uphill and a challenge. But then the church should be the prophetic voice to that. If the church recognizes the equal value of life, that human beings are created in the image of God, saying it is God who calls women. Let us be attentive, listening carefully to his calling and go by that rather than what people think about us, including the church. Amen.
So today I was asked to give some brief comments from the academic perspective on the topic of faith communities' responses to issues and instances of sex and gender-based violence. The best way for me to ground these comments, I think, will for me to share some insights from a project I'm currently involved with at the Science, Religion, and Culture program at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge. This project, which has been generously funded by IMA World Health, seeks to extend our understanding in the current literature on the roles and responsibilities of faith communities when responding to varied acts of violence against people on the basis of their gendered or sexual identities.
Would, however, also raise methodological and theoretical questions about the extent of this research, particularly in light of its scope and its approach. The IMA SGBV project that I'm involved in at the Science, Religion, and Culture program at Harvard Divinity School attempts to answer some of these questions through an integrative, multi-sided, qualitative study of faith communities in the Boston area. So some of the questions that the Broken Silence project brought up for us was, first, in addition to pastors, what do other members of the faith community have to say about SGBV? So one of the important things that we're trying to do with our project at the Harvard Divinity School is to really think about the ways in which stakeholders, members of the congregation, other different types of leaders or laity in the congregation are also responding to and understanding sexual and gender-based violence. What we found in kind of our initial findings and our initial work is that it's important, or it's not always the male pastors or just the head leaders, the senior leadership that is responding on the ground when someone says that they've been raped or abused or any instance of kind of sexual and gender-based violence. So for us, it's very important that when we go into these communities, when we do this research, that we're also talking to possibly members of the choir or even the leaders of the women's ministry, people who are actually within the congregation and not necessarily in these kind of high, kind of public positions of leadership in responding and understanding sexual and gender-based violence. The second question that we are asking are, how are responses and understanding of sex and gender-based violence different across faith traditions? So again, with the Broken Silence report, with the surveying of 1,000 Protestant members, we're asking, okay, if this is Protestant, how are also maybe Catholic, how are also Muslim or Jewish people of faith also thinking about sex and gender-based violence, and giving privilege to the ways in which our different faith traditions influence and impact and inform the ways that we think about violence in these communities. I think it goes without saying that there are different resources that become available to you across faith traditions, or based on your faith tradition rather, that really influence how you think about these concepts. So it's important for us to think about this multi-sided ethnography, this multi-sided qualitative research across faith traditions, and to give voice to the ways in which different people from different faiths outside of just the Christian Protestant faith are thinking about issues of sex and gender-based violence. And finally, what we're looking for in our IMA SGBV project at Harvard Divinity School is what more can we glean about faith communities, faith leaders, and sex and gender-based violence if we approach this relationship qualitatively. And so qualitative research, particularly ethnographic research that we're trying to work with congregations of these churches and mosques and synagogues, and also doing focus groups where a group of people can sit down together and think through some of the resources that they're pulling on to think about sex and gender-based violence. And what we're hoping is that through this kind of more robust qualitative research, that we won't just find out the data points that people maybe are underprepared or maybe people aren't responding in the ways in which we would think that they should, or that we would hope that they would, but that we're also figuring out where that comes from, what's that rooted in. So I just want to kind of wrap up my comments with thinking about the need for academic projects like IMA SGBV project, and also the Broken Silence report that I've been illuminating, or that I've been pointing to. And I said in the beginning that these types of works help us to not only illuminate the relationship between faith communities and sex and gender-based violence, or issues of sex and gender-based violence, but they also help us to contextualize them and to reimagine this relationship. In terms of illumination, this critical analysis can tell us more about the crucial relationship between faith communities, faith practices, and SGBV. Again, the literature hasn't been as robust as we would like, and so by doing this type of research, we're hoping that we can really shed light and make an intervention to tell these stories about how faith communities and how issues of sex and gender-based violence are so intricately related. Quantitative data can inform the activism and practice and allow us to build relationships across the multiple constituents, like the practitioner, like the minister, like the survivor, who are invested in this topic. And so when we do this research, what we're hoping is that it will be helpful and that it will be influential for people to actually go out and to end sex and gender-based violence, like Amy said at the beginning. So in terms of that, it's also thinking about reimagining helps us to propose new types of scholarship that can illuminate this topic more, and then to restart this kind of cycle of illumination and contextualization and then reimagining. So we're also trying to think about how scholarship outside of faith communities and outside of religious institutions might help us think about this relationship between faith and sex and gender-based violence. One point that really undergirds this is that not everyone is religiously committed in the ways that our research assumes or presumes. When we look at churches or synagogues or mosques, a lot of that might have to do with the ways in which people are kind of floating and finding their religious identity across different traditions, or may not feel rooted in particular institutions, but that the faith still illuminates and still is informative in terms of the ways in which they have experienced sex and gender-based violence or are responding to it. And so in terms of thinking about new scholarship, thinking about the ways in which we can get to ideas of this relationship between faith and these issues by thinking outside of our normative constructions of what religion or what faith institutions look like. So we stand ready to do this work and to be in relation with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, each and every one of you, for sharing your stories and your experience and your dedication to this issue. Thank you. And now we open it up for a time of questions and answers. And if you have cards that you filled out, feel free to pass those down the aisle. And I believe, who will be collecting them? Emily will be distributing, collecting them from you, and then I will take those questions from you.
On your seat, there should be note cards and pens. If you have anything, you can feel free to ask.
And if you have a question ready, if you can just raise your hand and Emily will come by. So this question is asking, I think this is to all of you or any of you that would like to respond. If in your experience,
there are any differences with churches that have female leaders or women clergy. Do you see that as a differentiating factor in how those faith communities particularly respond to sexual and gender-based violence?
So for my situation, both church congregations that I belonged to during the time that things took place had male pastors, so we did not have female leadership at that time, so don't have any input into that one.
It's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't think that we want to incriminate anyone. It's my culture. My culture allows polygamy. And when the woman runs to church, because she was married to this man in church, most of the time they don't get assistance from church. And you will find maybe church wardens who are polygamous, holding those very important positions in my Anglican church, and we look the other way. So I wouldn't really say men or women, but I have had instances where people have come to me about that. I don't know if I'm running away from answering the question.
Been a common thread is that there is this kind of distinction between men and women, and the kind of theological value that's been given through the biblical and different types of religious texts. So I think it's very important that we're mindful, particularly as we rethink the ways in which these resources can be helpful or harmful to addressing sex and gender-based violence, that we give privilege to gender-neutral language, and that also that we are thinking through the ways in which multiple people are experiencing gender in very different ways, outside of just a male-female binary. And I think that opens up new possibilities for ways in which that we can respond to it, as well as how we see people, right? If we see people as God invigorated, regardless of their gender, or regardless of their sexual orientation, or regardless of their biological distinctions, then that thus, I would say, invigorates or determines how we thus approach them. So, gender neutral language.
Anyone else?
Well, I also think that, some of us have to rethink our language, because socialization. We have been socialized to know that God is a man, Jesus is a man, and the King James Version talks about man. Ackerman, she feels very aggrieved about those kind of things. She's a feminist theologian, and she feels very strongly about the God who is a man.
She wants God as man, or she wants...
She's against God as male. A question about an interfaith component, and just a plea for all of you to speak, to reflect perhaps a bit more on the interfaith component of ending SGBV through your faith perspective. How important is that? And if you could elaborate a little bit more on how important it is to engage all different faith communities.
Well, I think it's important for,
Thank you. As I mentioned, it's really important for our project to be interfaith, because particularly what we're trying to push against in terms of the Broken Silence Report is that different people of different faiths are pulling on different resources in order to respond and understand sex and gender-based violence. So to kind of privilege a kind of Christian worldview, and in particular a Protestant Christian worldview, isn't necessarily helpful when we're talking to our Muslim sisters or Muslim brothers or Jewish sisters or Jewish brothers, or even agnostic, or just a myriad of different faith traditions. We have to be mindful of the ways in which their own kind of cultural and religious identities impact impact the possibility for them to understand and then to address it. So it's very important for us to be multi-faith in our project, and to bring those kind of conceptions into the conversation, so that we can have a more robust understanding of how faith influences sex and gender-based violence. Then we can also make particular interventions or particular recommendations for how to address it.
Can Bishop Wamukoya share a bit more about her journey theologically towards an understanding of gender and biblical truth?
Oh, that's a tough one. Well, I just believe that men and women in the sight of God are the same. We are equal in the face of God. And when God calls, He's not calling me as a woman or as a man, but God is calling a servant who happens to be female. And as I sit here, I look at myself as God's servant first and foremost. But I'm a God's servant who is a female. I know that, I also never just really like to engage in those confrontational biblical verses, the same story about Paul. The other day I was given a book by the canon who assists the primate here about Paul, and Paul is most of the time misunderstood to be against women. And the question is, if he was against women, why did he work with women? When you think of, I'm going to call her Aquila's wife, Priscilla. Priscilla is mentioned much more than Aquila in the Bible, and that it was Priscilla the tent maker. And today, if you think about tent making, you would equate that with men. So for me, it's really what God has put you to do. And I think the truth in the Bible is that there is no female or male, there is no slave or free person. And that's how I understand the biblical truth. What you believe is up to you. If when you look at me, you see a woman, it's up to you. But when I look at myself, I see a child of God and a servant of God. So that's the truth, according to me.
Question for Nikki. Can you please talk about how you teach your boys to be respectful of women?
Literally had that conversation on the way here. So from a very, very young age, I talked to my boys about appropriate touch and inappropriate touch. Did that from the very moment that I felt they could understand what it was that I was trying to tell them, so that they knew that even if somebody was saying, don't go speak to anyone, that they felt free to come tell me anything. And so that was very important to me from the very beginning. But we've had a lot of conversations with our boys, from, in all honesty, from pornography about, oftentimes it's not the woman's choice to be in front of the camera, all the way to how we expect them to treat their future wives. And so as you can tell, we have a huge age gap in between our boys from 19 to 9. And so we have a lot of opportunity to talk to each one of them at a variety of different stages about what we expect. And if they would choose to do anything inappropriate, they would have to worry about their mom before anybody else, because that would be an issue. So we've talked to them at a very young age. Yeah.
And I know that Connie and Bishop Milling are also mothers, if you would want to speak to that question as well.
In my house, and when they come to my house, the boys with their wives, it's the boys who cook for me and their wives. And they change the diapers of their children, and they take their children to the clinic. When we finish eating, the first person to reach the sink will wash the dishes. So it's not a question of, because I have one daughter, if she had to wash all the dishes and do all the cooking, then she would really be out of breath. And for me now, I'm a bishop, I don't go to the kitchen.
My boys were big when this happened to me. So they've learned from what they've seen. So when they had their own families, they started to treat their wives fairly, no beating. And I've been telling them that what they have seen already should not be practiced in their families. And they help their wives along. They take their children to clinics and to school.
I think maybe I should also add that we took each one of our boys individually and shared with them my history. And so they understood when we felt it was an appropriate time for them to hear about what had taken place for me, that we...
Those that are perpetrators of violence accountable.
Wow, these are tough questions. For me, we actually had a survivor weekend where we went to a retreat, and we did art about, how we were expressing what we were feeling, and we were in a room full of other survivors. So that was a really healthy moment for me to be able to hear what others had experienced and how they were looking at how they viewed things. And I'm not really sure how we hold people accountable. I know that we have to stop pushing it under the...
That cannot be done. And for so many times, she did that and she did not succeed. And for the other one that I had, whose husband was a policeman, the wife died. I mean, he was beaten to death. And before she would, during the beating, she managed to run away with the phone into the toilet, and she called me. So I had to walk down. But I could not get into the house. But I got help from other police people, and they got him out from the... Police got the man out from the house, and we rushed the woman to the hospital. On our arrival, she died. And the husband is put to jail. He's in jail now. In my country, the church preach about this. But like we said, if we love one another, then What are we going to do? We still don't find a way out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, she said it's hard questions. In my view is that we just have to keep on talking, and we have to confront the situations as they present themselves. I think one of the reasons why these things have continued for as long as they have is because we sweep them under the carpet. We know about them. We know that people are abusive, and I mean, we keep on saying amen as they preach. You know, we separate the two lives. There is the life in the pulpit and the life in the other space. So the lives in the different spaces don't belong together. It is very true that depending on our cultures, because in my culture, when we were growing up, to see that you are now, we have reached puberty and you are beginning to look like a young lady, the young man must touch your buttocks and you say, I don't want, and go. But you know, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. It's behind culture, hiding behind culture, but it's not acceptable. And from a man of God or a woman of God, because they are what we call now the Ben 10s, because even women also abuse boys. Here in the story, here I have a teacher who was abusing boys in her class. In fact, a boy in her class. And she wants to come back to school because she was sacked from the school. So I think then, you know, we need to talk about these things. The challenge sometimes is, what is the family going to say? What is the wife going to say, because she's not part of this? But you know, he's my husband. Whatever he has done, I am in a way part of it. I cannot just sit back and watch. I can decide to forgive him, but that does not mean that he should not be brought to book. So for me, I think we just have to keep on talking and confront the situations as the situations demand. And if it means taking them to the law or for legal, you know, appraisal, let them go that route. It doesn't matter that they are pastors or priests or whatever, imams, whatever you call them, sheikhs.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions and for these responses. As we near our time together now, I lift up several concrete ways that you can raise your voice. In your packets, the yellow packets that you received, you have some information about a declaration drawn up by faith leaders who met in London in February this year to discuss mobilizing faith communities and ending sexual violence in conflict. The meeting was co-hosted by the International We Will Speak Out Coalition and the UK government's Foreign and Commonwealth Office as a follow-up from the UK-hosted Global Summit on Ending Sexual Violence and Conflict that took place in June this last year, gathering together 123 government delegation alongside NGOs and other faith leaders. This faith leaders' declaration condemns sexual violence as a weapon of war and as a persistent legacy of conflict, and sets out a number of commitments based on defending values of faith and human rights, tackling impunity and promoting justice and accountability, supporting survivors of sexual violence, engaging men and boys in promoting positive masculinities, and working at peace building and peace processes. The declaration also calls on all faith leaders, all of us in this room, to join its authors in speaking out and working together with governments, national and international stakeholders, and communities to help end the use of sexual violence in conflict and in general. you are warmly, boldly invited to sign the declaration as committed individuals. You can do this online, and details are in your packet. And if you have any questions about this particular faith leaders consultation, please speak with Terry Robinson after the event, and Terry is here. We also invite you to join We Will Speak Out. Indeed, today we have been speaking out, and again, I thank you so much for doing so, for your incredible courage. Either as an individual or as an organization, or perhaps both, please join us. Should you have further questions about this movement of faith groups joining together, which is also found in your packets. All of these documents and other information, indeed it's a rich resource, can be found at wewillspeakout.us. I want to thank you so very, very much for joining us today, for your presence, and for raising your voice to break the silence and end sexual and gender-based violence. Go in peace. I am reminded to invite you, those that can join us, for a very casual reception at the Episcopal Church Center, which is, remind me, Kirsten, 815 2nd Avenue.
Between 44th and 43rd.
Between 44th and 43rd, 815 2nd Avenue. You're welcome to join us, and we do hope that we can continue this conversation there. Thanks again.